It's a conference the UN wants to make the turning point in tackling climate change. But the Copenhagen summit faces a number of hurdles as world leaders struggle to reach common ground. Just what are the root causes of climate change? And what does it really take to fix it before it's too late? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. It's been called the most important international meeting since the Second World War. Almost 200 heads of state are meeting in Copenhagen with one eventual aim: cooling the world. But as Alan Fisher reports, before it even started, some were predicting the summit would produce little more than hot air.
Heralding the start of the most significant international gathering in 60 years. Delegates from 192 countries are here. Their aim: to limit global warming and the impact it has on the climate. The mayor of the host city, Copenhagen, urged them to reach agreement.
I hope that when you leave this conference hall, you will leave the planet safer and greener for the future. So please help us to turn Copenhagen into Hopenhagen. Please seal the deal.
Delegates arrived to be met by small-scale protests in the early morning gloom, a reminder of what was at stake. People in Copenhagen insist this is a crucial meeting. The gathering's been slightly overshadowed by the row that's become known as ClimateGate, leaked emails which suggest scientists hid evidence which didn't back up the idea of man-made climate change. From the platform, the UN's top scientist dismissed the scandal.
The panel has a record of transparent and objective assessment stretching over 21 years, performed by tens of thousands of dedicated scientists from all corners of the globe.
The world's developed countries, the rich nations, have been talking down the prospect of a deal here in Copenhagen for months. But with many countries announcing firm emission targets, what might emerge is not the legally binding deal everyone hoped for, but something that is much better than everyone expected. The UN's top climate change envoy reminded delegates what's at stake.
The time for restating well-known positions is past. The time has come to reach out to each other. I urge you to build on your achievements, take up the work that has already been done, and turn it into real action.
Now the important debate and discussion gets underway. The world's leaders, more than 100 of them, will arrive for the last 4 days, which is when any agreements will be made, any deals will be signed. And the world will watch to see if the decision on the way ahead hits all the right notes. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, at the Climate Change Summit in Copenhagen.
Well, joining me on the programme today to discuss this further from Beirut, we have Najeeb Saab, head of the Arab Forum for Environment and Development. In Oxford, England, we have Mark Lynas, an advisor to the President of the Maldives on climate issues and author of the book 6 Degrees. And in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Jason Kowalski, a policy analyst with One Sky. That's another campaign group. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Mark Lynas, can I begin with you? It seems that the political consensus and effort to work towards a legally binding agreement is what many wanted there to be achieved, but that doesn't seem it's going to happen. It seems that a concrete roadmap is perhaps something that they can work towards in 2010. Is that the best we can expect?
Well, actually, things are looking a lot better than they were 2 weeks ago. And let's keep an eye on the bigger picture. This really is crunch time for humanity. This is the last chance that we all have as a species, if you like, to come together at a global level and restrain emissions of the gases which we know are beyond doubt warming the climate and are going to do so potentially with catastrophic effects by the end of the century. So it's very important that we come out of Copenhagen with something, and that something has to be significant. Whether it's legally binding or not is a different issue, but we've already got China and India and some of the major developing countries offering targets. Now that's never happened before. It's always been a case of forcing the industrialized countries to say how much they're going to continue reducing their emissions. Now we've got a lot more parties coming to the table making offers, so actually I think the prognosis is fairly optimistic.
Well, we'll certainly look into what individual countries are saying a little bit later in the programme. Just, Jason, what you've heard from Mark there in Oxford, England, he seems very optimistic. Do you share the same feeling?
I'm certainly optimistic. What the science demands and what justice demand here are that we get a fair, ambitious, and binding treaty as soon as possible. I agree with my colleague that things are certainly looking up in the last couple weeks. The participation from the President of the U.S., Barack Obama, later in the summit is a great sign. The participation of over 70 heads of state from all over the country is a great sign. This is certainly a big story on the international stage, and I think that it can lead to the foundation for a fair, ambitious, and binding treaty, hopefully as soon as possible.
And Najeeb Saab, just your initial thoughts on what you've heard now from both Washington, D.C. and Oxford, England. Do you feel the same way? Do you feel as optimistic as many other people think?
I feel as optimistic as your two other guests. I'm very happy. It's for the first time this week. I had been on many shows. Many were pessimistic. I say I'm an old-timer. The first report I wrote for UNEP on climate change was in 1988. We couldn't have dreamt we should reach a point which we have reached now, where there is a consensus in the world that the problem is there, that climate change is happening. What I describe it, we have agreed on the menu. Everybody agrees now on the cuts in emissions. What is remaining is to agree who will pay for the bill. I think who will pay for the bill, even if we don't reach final agreement in Copenhagen, I think it's not the end of the world. It will take few months to do it.
Okay, and Mark Lynas, can I come back to you then? Because in the lead up to the Copenhagen conference, we saw meetings in Bangkok and in Barcelona to try and iron out all of the problems that could possibly make the agreement stumble or fall to one side in Copenhagen. Why has it been so difficult to actually here say that there will be no legally binding agreement, but we must work towards an agreement in 2010 in Mexico City?
Well, because it depends on what you mean by legally binding. I mean, it's a very long process to actually get countries to sign up to something and then to ratify it in their own parliaments. I mean, part of the problem here is that the chance of the US actually ratifying the agreement in the Senate is next to zero. So we have to get something which President Obama can go back to his people and sell to them as a deal which is in their interest, at the same time as actually doing something which the science would support. And what happened at Barcelona and also at the Bangkok conference was that the talks tended to get stuck over money, as your previous correspondent said, and it really is about who forks out. The Prime Minister of the UK, Gordon Brown, suggested 100 billion per year. The EU has come close to that kind of figure in euros. And the major campaign groups are now calling for 200 billion a year. Remember, this is money that has to be paid by rich countries to poor countries, because the rich are the ones who've caused the problem, and they're already seeing major impacts in vulnerable countries in the developing world. So somebody has to cough up to actually make good some of the damage which is already being done by global warming.
Well, Jason Kowalski, of course, as Najeeb Saab said, it could possibly all boil down to money and the cost, and perhaps it's just too simple to say is it all down to who pays the bill? But countries like, for example, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Malawi, they want to develop greener initiatives, greener infrastructure, and that does cost money, and they want the richer countries to pay for it. Is it a realistic probability that that line of thought about the finances of who will fund all this may come out of this conference?
Well, that message certainly isn't precisely what will move the U.S. Senate to action, but I think when you look at the brass tacks of what we need to do here, getting off coal, deploying renewable energy throughout the world, there are plenty of American companies who want to sell that technology abroad, and we need to make the kind of bill and the kind of agreement that will spur the development of those technologies, shut down old dirty coal plants that are providing America with half of its power right now, and invest in new technologies and new industries that will create the kind of jobs that will take developed countries like America out of the little economic slip we're in right now. I think the road to a successful, fair, binding, and ambitious treaty certainly goes through the U.S. Senate. We're close in this country. We've had a lot of momentum. We had a president that campaigned on the promise of global leadership on this issue, and now he's been in office for a year, and he's got a lot on his plate. He's been working very hard on health care right now, which has taken up a lot of time in the U.S. Senate, and climate's certainly next up, but we need to do a bit of work to get there.
Well, I was going to say,
and I think the political agreement. Yep.
No, Jason, all I was going to say, and just come in there, when you say that he's working very hard for a greener administration, you might say. If we look at one particular incident, a small town in Texas had $7.5 billion installed to put in wind farms, windmills, to provide energy there, non-fossil-based energy, for a town of 15,000 inhabitants. You know, it's a lot of money, isn't it? Even if you're talking about American companies wanting to sell their technology abroad, $7.5 billion to a country like Bangladesh, it seems outrageous.
It's certainly a lot of money. One thing that's on the table right now is about $3 billion in the short term, but it needs to ramp up over time. The whole system of investment has the potential to spur millions of jobs nationwide in this country. We're already getting over $80 billion in investment in our stimulus package this year. A lot of that was being matched in private capital. That kind of government spending is what's politically popular in this country for the sake of creating jobs and getting us out of the economic slump we're in. And I think a lot of the kind of spending we're seeing that needs to go abroad will be spurred by the kind of domestic action that the United States needs to take, reducing its emissions, investing in clean energy, and creating new industries.
Najeeb Saab, in Beirut, do you think the focus of this conference should be as much on renewable sources of energy than just talking about how to lower carbon emissions?
No, to tell you frankly, they are interrelated. And if we take a region like the Middle East, Arab countries, regardless of climate change, they need to be more efficient in use of energy. The report which we have published 2 weeks ago on the impact of climate change on Arab countries found out that with simple measures for energy efficiency, Arab countries can reduce consumption of energy by 50%. So regardless of climate change, a lot can be done. Going back to green economy, remember the Middle East region, you have 25% of young people between 19 and 30 unemployed. Green economy, including energy efficiency, renewable energy, will create jobs. It will move places like Dubai from virtual economy to real economy with real jobs for people. So it has benefits, actually. We shouldn't look at it only as consuming money.
OK, well, we've had a broad idea of what we're talking about here. And before we actually sort of focus in on country-to-country relationships, from the Philippines to Bangladesh, all voices merge in one call, loud and clear: save the planet. Just want you to hear now what some of those global voices are saying.
We asked the world leaders to have a binding treaty out in Copenhagen after they meet this December. However, we know that the U.S. would not want this to happen, and we are actually working here in the Philippines, calling for the U.S. and our government to move and bind themselves into a treaty much more stronger than Kyoto Protocol.
The tidal waters are still flooding our villages. These children do not have homes anymore, and neither do I. That's why we are having to hold classes on the street.
We faced the full force of the last cyclone, but we got away with our lives because of the embankment next to our house. Compared to the other villages, we did not suffer much damage. If we didn't have this embankment, we would not have escaped with our lives. We would have been washed away with our homes and our children.
Whether Bangladesh will be heard at Copenhagen, I think they will be heard. They will be heard by ordinary men and women across the world. Whether they'll be heard by those that are negotiating for the most powerful countries at the Copenhagen talks, I believe they will be heard. But whether hearing and acting are two different things, whether they will act with the urgency that is called for, that remains to be seen.
Well, voices there from around the globe. Mark, Lynas, you heard what those ordinary citizens of the planet had to say. Post-industrial economies like the USA and Europe became prosperous by burning fossil fuels and developing their countries. And now we have emerging countries known as the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India and China, who resent having to decarbonise, if I can put it that simplistically. They've announced their own decreases for carbon emissions. But what do you think would be their best case scenario for this Copenhagen conference?
Well, the problem that the world has got is that 4 out of the 5 top emitters globally are actually industrialized countries. I mean, that's Brazil, Indonesia, primarily because of deforestation emissions, and also China and India, and of course the US there is at number 2. But we can't solve this problem without the developing countries being participants, even though their historical responsibility for causing this problem is much less, and their per capita emissions, so per person, if you average it out, it's also much lower than industrialized countries. But personally, I think there's an opportunity here, because whilst it's very expensive to decarbonize somewhere like the US or even Europe, because there's so much, they depend so much on fossil fuels. Actually, if you go to the poorer countries like Bangladesh or like Vietnam or somewhere where they don't have all of this infrastructure, you can actually start the decarbonisation process much more cheaply, and you can actually develop their economies in a low carbon way, and it's actually much more cost effective to start doing that now than actually have to then go back once they've already got dependent on fossil fuels and start and do a different thing. So I think we should turn this debate around and actually talk about how we can decarbonise developing countries first to avoid all these emissions ever happening in the future.
But if that's the debate that continues after Copenhagen, then so be it. But there are certain countries, Najeeb Saab, who perhaps are a bit sceptical. And if you just mentioned there about fossil fuel economies, such as the Middle East countries, certainly, and OPEC members who produce so much oil for the international market, surely they'll be a bit worried if the world wants to reduce carbon emissions, because that means less oil being burnt, therefore less oil being produced, less money going into their coffers.
There are two facets for this, actually. It is unfair to put all the blame on the suppliers, on the supply side. You have the demand side. They are supplying because there has been increasing demand in industrialized countries. This is on one hand. On the other hand, we shouldn't forget that many of those oil-producing countries, their reputation is that they are very rich. Take Saudi Arabia. Per capita income is $18,000, less than Portugal, one of the poorest European countries. In the Netherlands, it's 50,000. I mean, just those countries still have demands for development for their own people. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it's very important for them to stop being frightened. Until now, many of those countries, oil producers, their strategy was to obstruct negotiations because they were afraid they will lose their income. Economically, this is not true, actually, because even if Copenhagen goes for the limit of 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide, still in 2030, the production of oil will increase by 11 million barrels. Still in 2030, the income from oil will be 4 times more what it is today. So I don't see the reason to be frightened. Oil countries should accept to be part of the world negotiations, of the world consensus, and start very fast to develop their economies, to diversify. We have good examples in the region already.
Sure.
Masdar City in Abu Dhabi is to develop green methods to use conventional energy plus renewable energy. King Abdullah University for Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia was a great example to develop energy science in the region. They should put more efforts in this regard than just to be afraid of developments.
Well, we're certainly touching on a lot of bases here. I want the next question really to come to Mark Lynas and Jason Kowalski. Mark, if I just come to you for this one. Population growth perhaps hasn't been discussed, and the world and the globe has changed over the past 100 years, and that too has put pressure on the world's resources, and therefore surely climate change is directly and indirectly related to population growth. Do you think that will be discussed, or is it again an issue that will be discussed later?
It won't be discussed explicitly, no. I mean, population growth is one of the underlying drivers of a whole lot of environmental issues. Remember, climate change is just one. We've also got biodiversity loss to worry about, nitrogen pollution, quite a lot of other things which are also important at a planetary scale. And in fact, a scientific team recently published in the journal Nature a first conceptual overview of what they call planetary boundaries. 9 issues to be concerned about at a planetary level, climate change being one of them. And the increasing number of human beings, of course, is a very important factor there. But it's not the first thing that we should look at, I don't think, when we're talking about climate change. We really need to look at carbon, because that's where the pollution is actually affecting the atmosphere. And even if human population growth can be restrained in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we still need to decarbonize the world economy. So I think we need to look more at the supply side than the demand side for this particular issue right now.
Okay. Jason, thinking about the population itself, I mean, just give us a sense from North America about the importance of climate change within American or North American society as such, and whether when they see pictures of the Maldives cabinet having a meeting underwater, or the Nepalese government having a cabinet meeting at the base camp of Everest, they actually realise what's going on in countries that will be affected the most before themselves.
I think you certainly need to look at population when you look at carbon. I mean, if you look at America, you look at an economy that's 10 times more carbon intensive per person than the Chinese. We talk a lot about what they need to do. What about what we need to do? To get to 350 parts per million, or even have a shot of that kind of an aggressive stabilization pathway, science says that developed countries like the US need to cut their emissions somewhere along the lines of 25 to 40% below 1990 levels. On a whole, developed countries are going to Copenhagen with a promise of about 15% cuts, and the U.S. is only anteing up to about 4%. We have a very high per capita emissions in this country, and that's something I think we need to worry about.
OK, well, just as we near the end of our programme, a final thought on perhaps this question for all 3 of our guests. The Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom has published, along with 56 other newspapers in 45 countries, a joint editorial warning politicians that the failure to reach, and I quote, a fair and effective deal is crucial. The media, of course, taking the forefront. They have for many years across the globe to try and make everyone aware about what's going on in the climate based on scientific research. Mark, Lynas, what is the best scenario to come out of Copenhagen after the talks of 2 weeks?
Well, the best scenario to come out of Copenhagen is probably quite a different thing from what the planet actually needs. I mean, we need ultimately to get an agreement amongst human beings that we'll see carbon concentrations in the atmosphere back down at 350 parts per million. They're currently at 387. That's the only thing that can save the Maldives and other vulnerable countries. So this isn't the be-all and the end-all what happens in the next 2 weeks, to be honest, because what's politically feasible for the leaders attending today won't actually save the planet in a meaningful sense. But I think it is going to be an important intermediate step, and it's important that the ground is shifting so far as well in the right direction.
OK, Najeeb Saab in Beirut, what are your final thoughts on that? What can be achieved from Copenhagen?
I think even if we can achieve a good roadmap to continue in 2010 will be okay. The most important thing is to give very clear signal of the need to reduce emissions by 25 to 30% by 2020 compared to 1990, by 80% by 2050. And what was mentioned at the beginning of this program is very important, that for the first time we see commitments from countries like China, like Brazil, like India. I would like to see commitments from my region, from the Arab oil producers in this summit.
Okay.
I would like them to come forward and put some commitments.
Okay, and Jason Kowalski, very briefly, your final thoughts on what might come out of Copenhagen?
I would like to see more leadership from the United States on this issue. I think President Obama's attending the event is very important, but I think this is a huge opportunity to push the U.S. Senate into action. I think we can get a strong bill in the Senate this year, and I think we can get a fair, ambitious, and binding treaty, hopefully in 1 year's time.
Well, let's see what does happen. To all of my guests on this edition of Inside Story in Beirut, in Oxford and in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story, and thank you very much for joining me on the programme. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. Thanks very much for your time and your company.